This is CD 1 and contains the first half of Disciple 1, Lesson 9.
We are continuing in the body of literature in the Old Testament where God is working out in the stuff of history His promise and His covenant. Now I'm going to give you a test. I keep going back because I think repetition is a great way of learning, and we keep going back and picking up. Where was the beginning of the promise? The promise that God made to the world. Where is its beginning in the Bible? Genesis 3:15. Okay. He's coming. He's coming. Where is the beginning of the covenant that God made with one man? Of course, it was Moses. It's farther back. Abraham. And where is that found in the book of Genesis? Bingo. Genesis chapter 15. That strange story where God put Abraham to sleep and walked in between the pieces of the animals. And then, of course, we come on up to the time of Jesus when Jesus sat around the table with His disciples and said, "This is my blood of the new covenant." So it all ties in. So God is working out His promise and His covenant in the stuff of history. Well, what stuff in history is needed in order that this promise and this covenant might be finished and fulfilled? Well, three things. A people, a land, and a constitution. Of course, we see Him now gathering His people. Last week in the books of Joshua and Judges, we saw now that God leads His people to the promised land. And of course, the constitution being the law, and primarily the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments. So God is a God of history. And by the way, that separates our God from all other so-called gods and religious gods who are not gods of history, but gods of Never Never Land, and it happened here and there, and it's nothing that we can actually verify in history, but the Bible is verifiable in history. With that little preamble, let's jump into the book of Samuel. If you'll turn with me to 1 Samuel, we essentially are going to be covering the era of biblical history known as the United Monarchy. If you were to put a date parameter on that, it would be 1100 BC to 930 BC. That is the era of the United Monarchy. So the books of 1 and 2 Samuel now take us into a different era as God is continuing to carry out His plan, His purpose, and His covenant. Samuel wore two hats. Samuel was the last of the judges and the first of what we would call the classical prophets. So he was the last judge and the first prophet. The last judge because Samuel was a deliverer. He was a military guy. So he was leading the people in military action against those pesky irritants known as the Philistines. By the way, the Philistines, this is a map of Israel, but the Philistines lived over here on the coastal area with the cities of Ashdod and Ascalon. When they talk about the Gaza Strip today, that's the place where the Philistines used to live. And incidentally, another bit of information, the word Palestine. You know where that comes from? The word Philistine. Palestine literally means the land of the Philistines. Interesting. Okay, turn with me to 1 Samuel. And in the first chapters of Samuel, of course, we read about a lady named Hannah. Beautiful, beautiful story. Who had a little boy. And what was his name? Samuel. Okay. During this time, the high priest was Eli. During this time, also, the tabernacle, you know what I mean by the tent of meeting or the tabernacle, was located right here in a city called Shiloh. That's where they had set it up. They had sort of permanently placed it there. It was still a tent. It was still portable. They didn't build any type of permanent temple. That didn't happen until the time of Solomon. But right here in the city of Shiloh was where the Ark of the Covenant and the temple, or the tabernacle, was at that time. The high priest was a fellow by the name of Eli. And look with me in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And let's read some things about Eli's wonderful sons. He had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And they were supposed to be sons of the high priest. But we read in chapter 2, verse 12, Eli's sons were what? Is that where the old PK thing came from, I wonder? Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, Keith. By the way, it gets worse. Look at chapter 2, verse 22. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Now, you might call that sanctified hanky-panky. But nonetheless, that was the kind of persons that they were. And in chapter 2, verse 34, a man of God, it doesn't say who he was, but a prophet or a man of God said, "What happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day." So that's a grim prediction of things to come, but as we shall see in a few moments, the prophet was right on target. In chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, we have that beautiful story of little Samuel who actually lived there in the tent of meeting there with the high priest. And one night, in the middle of the night, he heard a voice. Beautiful story. And he went running into and said, "Eli, did you call me?" And Eli said, "No, Samuel, I didn't call you." So he went back to bed, and a little bit later he heard the voice again. So he went running back into Eli. "Eli, did you call me?" "No, I didn't. But if you hear the voice again, say these words, 'Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth.'" So he went back in there and went to sleep, and then a little bit later on he heard the voice again, and he said, "Okay, Lord, I'm listening. Tell me what you want me to hear." And of course, what he heard, he was very reluctant to tell Eli because it wasn't good news, was it? It was basically the destruction of Eli as a high priest and his sons, who were very, very wicked people. And we'll see in a few moments that indeed happened. Now, again, the date of this is around 1100 BC. 1100 BC. Now, look with me in chapter 4. We begin to see some of these grim prophecies, how they came true. Now, notice what was happening here. This is known as the Battle of Aphek. Aphek. And Aphek is right here, over near the coast. And so the Israelites came against the Philistines. And in chapter 4, verse number 3, look at the last part of that verse. There's something interesting here. Notice what the people of Israel said. "Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." In other words, hey, the Philistines want to fight? No problem. Just go get the Ark of the Covenant, put it out front, and when you do that, hey, magically, abracadabra, poof, the genie will appear, and God will win our battle for us. Well, look at chapter 4, verse number 11. "In the heat of the battle, the Philistines won. The Ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died." Didn't we just read a few moments ago that would happen? Now, there's a sermon in here, and I'm going to give you just a little taste of it. Notice how the people of God had a wrong idea. Their idea was, it doesn't make a difference how we live or the condition of our hearts. We'll just put the Ark of the Covenant out in front of us, and magically God will win the war for us. It didn't happen. Even though the Ark of the Covenant was out in front, they were defeated. We do the same thing today, don't we? In our lives. Rather than looking at our own heart, sometimes we say, "Well, God, it really doesn't matter how I live. I've been baptized, God." And you can ask some people, "Are you a Christian?" "Well, I was baptized." It's not what I ask you. "Are you a Christian?" "Well, I go to church." Not what I ask you. "Are you a Christian?" "Well, I tithe." "Well, wonderful. But that's not what I ask you." You see, all these are arks of the covenant. And sometimes these arks of the covenant can hide the true state of my heart. God, don't look at my heart, but God, look how many times I come to church. Don't look at the things I've done, Lord. Don't look at my heart. But God, remember when I was baptized, God? I was baptized. Remember that guy? Remember when I was confirmed? So we can take all of these religious things and put them out in front sometimes to hide the true state of our heart. And it will not work. Your baptism won't suffice. Your confirmation won't suffice. Your tithing won't be good enough. Your church attendance won't get the job done if your heart's not right. So that's what they did, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, God, what happened? We were defeated, and the Ark of the Covenant is gone. All right, we'll come back to that. But look at chapters 5 and 6. Notice what the Philistines did. The Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant, and they took it back home with them, here to Ashdod, and they placed it in a tent alongside their God. Interesting story here. And by the way, they worshipped D-A-G-O-N, Dagon, the fish god. So they take the Ark of the Covenant and they said, okay, the more gods, the merrier. The more gods we have, the stronger we'll be. You know, another day, another dollar, another god. So bring the Ark of the Covenant, put it in here beside Dagon. Well, interesting, the next morning when they got up and they went out there, what had happened to this statue of Dagon? It had bit the dust. They thought, okay, maybe an earthquake happened during the night. Let's pick him back up. Okay, God, hang on. We're going to pick you back up now. We're going to set you up. Okay. The next day, what happened? Same thing. They began to realize, maybe this Ark of the Covenant represents a God that's more than just any other God that we've ever seen. Maybe our God falling before this Ark of the Covenant is telling us something, that this God is more powerful than our God. In essence, it's the same thing with, you remember the Exodus and all the plagues, where God was showing the people who was God. The Egyptian gods weren't God. He was God. Well, the same thing's happening here. Well, finally, they began to have boils on them and rats infestation. And finally, they said, let's get this Ark of the Covenant out of here. Ever since that thing has come, we've had nothing but trouble. So they put it on a cart pulled by two lowing cows, and the cows take it to a place called Kiriath Yearim, which is about right in here. And look at chapter 7, verse number 2. I just want to show you this, and we're going to come back to it later on. It's really interesting. Chapter 7, verse 2. It was a long time, 20 years in all, that the ark remained at Kiriath Yearim. Now, during this time, from about 1100 to 1050 BC, which is the time we're talking about, the people didn't have a king. God wanted to be their king. God desired it to be a theocracy. Theocracy is where God is actually in control of the government of his people. But the people began to cry for something else, didn't they? They began to cry for a king. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 8. The people were saying, we want a king. Look at verse 6. Give us a king to lead us. In other words, they wanted to be like all the other nations. We want a king to rule over us. And Samuel tried to tell them. Look at chapter 8, verse 11. This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He'll take your sons. He'll make them serve. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war. He'll take your daughters, verse 13, to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards. In other words, he's going to take everything you've got. Why do you want a king? This is not God's will. But look at verse 19. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles for us. We want a king. And God basically said to Samuel, Samuel, back off. They want a king. Let's give them a king. And so in chapter 9, we are introduced to a man who was a Benjamite. Now, who was Benjamin? One of the 12 sons of Jacob, remember? Okay. So he was of the tribe of Benjamin. Notice verse 2. It says he was impressive, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. So here was a guy who, by all appearances, had what it takes to be a king and a ruler and a trusted leader. Now don't turn to this, but according to Acts, that's right, in the New Testament, Acts chapter 13, verse 21, it tells us that Saul reigned over Israel for 40 years. So Saul was anointed king by Samuel. Now, I said Samuel was the last of the judges and the first of the prophets. Now, he was a judge because he did lead the people into military action, but he was prophet because one of the major responsibilities of an Old Testament prophet was to anoint a king, to coronate him, and to anoint him, to inaugurate him, if you will, to begin his kingship. Now, something interesting that we need to understand here, and this word anoint, what they would do is they would take a flask of oil and they would break it and they would pour it on, say, Saul's head, and they would anoint him. And this would be the beginning, his coronation into his kingship. And so from that point on, the king was looked at as God's anointed one to be the visible representative of God to lead the people. Now, here's what I want you to hear. The Hebrew word for anointed one is Mashiach. That's where we get our word Messiah. The word Messiah means anointed one. So, Samuel anointed Saul as king. He was off to a good start. He seemed by all appearance to be the one who could really lead the people. But did you notice how quickly things began to change? In my opinion, Saul is probably the most tragic figure in all of the Bible, even more so than Judas Iscariot. Tragic. He's off to a good start. I mean, by all appearances, he should be strong and a good leader, but things began to change. Now, let's put some dates down and to show you. Saul, his reign was from 1050 to 1010 BC. So Saul is the first king of the United Monarchy. Okay, so he was off to a good start, but things drastically changed. And what I want us to try to do tonight is to try to look at the biblical evidence, and let's come up with a psychological profile of Saul. I want to know what went wrong with this guy. He's off to a good start, but things really went bad and went downhill quickly. So as we talk about these things, let's try to get a feel, not just an understanding, but let's try to get a feel for what happened to Saul. What type of person was he, and where did he go wrong? Well, I want to show you the 3 strikes which were against Saul, which put him out. The first strike is in chapter 13. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 13. And in chapter 13, the Israelites were about to fight who? The Philistines at a little town called Gilgal. Now, put your finger here and turn back with me, you got to see something, to chapter 10, verse number 8. Samuel had given Saul strict instructions. Chapter 10, verse 8. Samuel said to Saul, "Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. But you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do." In other words, Saul, do not go to battle until I arrive, until I have a sacrifice service of worship to get God's blessings before we actually go into battle. Wait. Do not do anything. Well, if you look back at chapter 13, Saul waited 5 days. He waited 6 days, and I guess it was on the 7th day, and I can see him pacing back and forth, thinking, where is Samuel? Where is Samuel? He told me to wait, but we've got to do something quickly. And finally, in verse number 9, notice what Saul did. Chapter 13, verse 9. Saul said, bring me the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Now look at this. You could make a movie on this. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived. I can see that on a television screen. Here's old Saul. He's offering the burnt offering, and in the background, walking over the hill, comes none other than the last person Saul wanted to see at that moment. And notice what Samuel said in verse 11. What have you done? Look at verse 13. Some pretty harsh words here. You acted foolishly, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought after a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's commands. Now this is just one piece of the puzzle. We're going to put a whole puzzle piece together. But when I think of a man, I want you to give me the word that describes. We want to kind of come up with some words to describe Saul. But here's a guy who basically said, I'm not going to wait on God's prophet. I'm not going to wait on God. I'm going to take this matter into my own hands, and I'm going to do it when I want to do it. I'm going to do it just like I want to do it. Now, to me, a word that readily comes to mind, it's not a very pretty word. I'm not sure I'm spelling it right, but it's the word arrogant. I think here was a man who was sort of began to portray an arrogant type of attitude that I'm going to do things my way. I'm going to do it when I want to do it. I'm not going to wait on God or a prophet or anybody else. I'm going to do things like I want it. I'm going to do things my way. And what he did was, he was wrong because he assumed a priestly role. It was not to do that. He assumed a priestly role. Took matters into his own hands. I'll do this thing by myself, with or without God. So here's sort of an arrogant assuming of a role that was not his to assume. Keith.
He was chosen for his size and his good looks. He wasn't chosen for his holiness or his...
No. Well, obviously he was off to somewhat of a good start, I think. But I think God was, and God does this, by the way, and he'll do it with you and me if we don't watch it. And that is, if we're so doggone stubborn, God sometimes, to teach us something, he'll give us what we ask for.
That's why they say be careful what you ask for.
Sometimes, and I think God is saying, okay, you want a king? Have at it. Go ahead. Choose who you want. Go on. And of course, they chose the tall, dark, and handsome guy. Man, look at this guy. Man, he can lead us. He can whip anybody. This will be our king. And what God is beginning to teach them is, did you notice what God said, what Samuel said? Saul, God is in the process of refusing you, and he's choosing, now listen, a man after his own heart. Does God look at the outward, or does he look at the heart? God looks at the heart, doesn't he? So by all human standards, Saul was the man. So God said, okay, go ahead. And they learned the hard way. So be careful sometimes. Sometimes if we're stubborn with God, he may just give us what we want. But it won't be long before we're saying, oh God, can you take this back? And he says, I thought you never asked.
Saul didn't want to be king first, did he?
No. He was hiding. He was hiding. Isn't that interesting?
So kind of modest. So how can you be modest and arrogant? Or did he grow into being arrogant?
Well, something happened here. That's part of that profile. He seems to be sort of a shy individual. But then, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but in just a few chapters from now, he's erecting monuments to himself. I mean, this guy literally went off his rocker. But that's a good observation. All right, let's move on. Let's put this profile together. The second strike for Saul came in chapter 14. Now, you can't really call this a disobedience or a transgression or a sin, but you can call it plain old stupid. Look at chapter 14, verse 24. They were going out to fight, guess who? The Philistines. And Saul now was becoming more and more prideful, and he said in chapter 14, verse 24, now the men of Israel were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, and before I have avenged myself on my enemies. Notice the pronouns there. He didn't say before I have avenged the name of the Lord, but I have avenged myself on my enemies. Okay, okay? And so he makes this blanket statement. Nobody better eat anything before we win or you're dead meat. Look at verse 27. Now we're introduced to a young man by the name of Jonathan. Who was Jonathan? Saul's son, who became David's bosom buddy, by the way. But look at verse 27. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb, and he raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. In other words, he nourished himself and sort of restored his strength. Well, look at chapter, we've already read that. But what was Saul going to do when Saul learned what Jonathan had done? He was going to kill him. He was going to kill his only son simply because, by God, I've made this curse now, I've made this statement, and nobody is going to be exempt from what I have said. Now, notice what happened in chapter 14, verse 45. When the people learned that Saul, just to make sure that his word was kept, was going to kill his own son, the people said to Saul, should Jonathan die? He who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Now think psychologically. What do you think the people were beginning to think about Saul? What was happening? How were the people beginning to look at Saul now?
They didn't trust him.
Okay, they began to lose respect for him, didn't they? They thought, hey, what's wrong with this guy? I mean, he's going to kill his own son just to keep his word. We're not sure we can trust this guy. So here's a guy that obviously is extremely impulsive. He says something, I'm going to do it. Just because I said it, I'm going to do it. Didn't think about it. And so the people had to step in and rescue him from killing his own son. And so people began to lose respect for Saul. What happens when people begin to lose respect for a leader? Now, I'm not talking politically. Please, I'm not me. Don't you dare misunderstand me. This has nothing to do with politics in Washington, D.C. I'm making a blanket statement. But what happens when people begin to lose respect for a leader? Whether it be in Russia or here or in the Bible or what? Well, the leader then loses his platform to lead. Well, that's what's happening now. So here's a man who seems to be quite arrogant, quite impulsive, and now he's just done something stupid, and the people are beginning to lose respect and trust for him. Well, let's go on to strike number 3, which happens in the very next chapter. Interesting. Chapters 13, 14, and 15. Strike 1, 2, 3. Now, will you put your finger in chapter 15 just a moment and turn back with me to Deuteronomy? Chapter 25. There's something we've got to understand here before we understand what's happening. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse number 19. And it's not a very pretty verse, but that's the way it is. This was one of the nations that had evidently tried to stop Israel and God's progress of leading and developing the covenant. And so, here in chapter 25, verse 19, notice what is said. when the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek. Okay, turn back with me to 1 Samuel. Now, Amalek's descendants were called the Amalekites. Here in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, the Israelites came up against the people known as the Amalekites. So this task of obliterating the Amalekites rested on the man named Saul. But notice in the chapter 15 here, when Saul and when Israel defeated the Amalekites, did Saul obey Deuteronomy 25? Did he completely obliterate all of them and destroy?
No.
He did not, did he? What did he do?
He kept the animals.
Kept the king.
Bingo. He kept the king. Now look at verse number 7, chapter 15. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. Now, look down at verse number 12. I'm sorry, verse 13. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears, and what is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Now notice how Saul answers that. The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord. What's the next word? Your God. But we totally destroyed the rest. And Samuel said to him one of the greatest statements. Look over at verse number 22. But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice." Now, let's try to put it together. What's going on here? Why did Saul disobey and spare the king and the best of the animals? Well, the only answer that I know of is he spared the king so that he could parade him around and say, "Everybody, look what I did. Look how powerful I am and how I've captured this king." He spared the best of the animals. He said for religious reasons. I doubt it. Probably for his own reasons. So we have to add another word to his psychological profile, of course, and that is that here is a man who is proven to be quite unfaithful. The people can't trust him, and now God can't trust him. Arrogant, impulsive, unfaithful. And now look at chapter 15, verse number 12. This is wild. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, "Saul has gone to Carmel, and there he has set up a monument in his own honor, and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal." Now, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but something tells me that when people start erecting images and monuments to themselves, something ain't right. Something just not right. So we got to add another word to his psychological profile, and that, of course, is, and I'm being nice, he's very, very prideful. Pride. So here's a man who's going to do things his way, come hell or high water. I'm going to do it. Here's a man who is very, very impulsive, does things without thinking about the implications, the ramifications, and the results of that. I'm going to do something. The people had to jump in and stop him. They began to lose trust and respect for him. Here's a man who blatantly was unfaithful in carrying out a command of the Lord. And here was a man who began to erect monuments to himself out of pride. I see a guy who's really mentally going off his rocker. Now, we've got to add to this, and again, I'm being very nice here, but there is some real emotional instability here. Because while all this is going on and Saul's is declining, and he's declining in the eyes of the people, and he's declining in the eyes of the Lord, he can no longer be trusted, he's no longer faithful, he's erecting monuments to himself. While this is going on, there's a little boy out in the shepherd's fields. There's a little boy. By observation, you would look at him and say, he'll never amount to nothing. He's not tall, dark, and handsome, evidently. But we read that in the meantime, while Saul is doing this, God has chosen another young boy who's going to be the next king of Israel. I like to think of David out in the shepherd's fields. I mean, if you're out in the Judean desert, you've been there, it's desolate. I mean, desolate. And you're out with this flock of sheep. What are some things you can do to pass the time while you're watching sheep? Throw rocks. Slingshot. So in other words, he probably had plenty of time to practice his slingshot. Become quite a marksman at that. I imagine David became quite a marksman with the rod. You know, the rod and the staff. Of course, the shepherd's staff was used for different reasons. But the rod was a club about yea long, and a shepherd was a marksman at using the rod, and he used it for different reasons. Say he looks and maybe 30 yards away, one of his little lambs has strayed away from the rest of the sheep, which they were prone to do. And sheep will put their nose down, and they will eat grass, and they will drink old muddy water with flukes in it and worms in it, and they won't even look up. They'll just keep on drinking, keep on eating. And there might be a cliff there, and they'll just fall over the cliff. That's how dumb a sheep is. Do what?
They're the dumbest animal alive.
They are the dumbest animal alive. So here's David. And David sees one of his sheep in trouble. And the sheep doesn't even know it. You know what he does? He takes that rod that he has attached to his belt or rope or whatever, and he takes it and he hurls it. He doesn't hit the sheep, but he hits just on the other side of the sheep. And it startles the sheep, and he looks up and sees the danger he's in, and he goes trotting back with the rest of the sheep. Or if he's out one day watching his sheep and he sees a jackal sniffing around, dinner. He can take that club or that rod, and being the marksman he is, he can hurl that right at the jackal and hit him right on the head. Pop! And that old jackal will stagger away, and the sheep are safe. So the rod was the way that the shepherd would protect his sheep from predators, or protect them from themselves when they were about to get into trouble that they didn't even realize. So imagine all those times of solitude out there in the desert when David thought, I'm out here by myself. No, he wasn't. And that's why in later years, looking back over his life, David penned these words. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Why, he makes me to lie down in green pastures, just like I did my little lambs that I loved so much. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. And even though I go through the valley of dark shadows, I don't have to be afraid. I can remember when my sheep would go through dark places, I was right there with them. I loved them. For the Lord is my shepherd. He protects me. And see, so David began to see God's relationship with him as he loved his sheep. And so all that took place out there in the Judean desert as this young boy was obviously didn't even know it, but God was preparing him for what lay ahead. Now, when God chose David to be the next king, that's a beautiful story too. He told Samuel, he said, now Samuel, I want you to go to Jesse's house when it was time to anoint him king. Of course, Saul was still king. And so Samuel went to Jesse's house, and Jesse had several sons. By the way, remember that name, Jesse. You'll need to remember that on the final test. That's David's father. And so Samuel told Jesse, he said, Jesse, God has anointed one of your sons to be king. And I can see old Jesse puffing up now, popping some buttons on my son's going to be king. Hey, boys, come here. Line up right here. And so he brought all of his good-looking, tall, dark, and handsome sons out, and Samuel goes to each one at a time. No, it's not him. No, it's not him. And finally he goes through all the sons, and none of them. And Samuel turns to Jesse and says, Jesse, don't you have any more boys? And Jesse says, well, yeah, I have a little run out here in the fields keeping sheep, but there's no need to bring him in. Come on, bring him in, Jesse. Let's have a look at him. David, come here. So David comes in, and Samuel takes one look at him and says, this is him. Now, do you hear the sermon in there? Saul, by all appearances, man, he was the superstar. But inside, he was bankrupt. David, by all the outward appearances, he shouldn't be anything. But here was a young man who out there in those Judean deserts was learning about God through his relationship with the sheep. And his faith was growing. And his heart was growing. And so David was a man after God's own heart. Well, he proved himself one day, didn't he? When one day the Israelites came up against who? The Philistines. But this time they had a 9 feet tall giant. That's how tall Goliath was. 9 feet tall. Bobcats would like to have him, wouldn't they? And so he comes out huffing and puffing and cussing and everything. And of course the Israelites are standing there, and their knees are knocking. And even Saul standing there, this big shot, he's nothing now. And little David walks up and says, what's going on? Why are we letting this big guy taunt us? And Saul says, son, you stay back. This guy will kill you. And David said, I don't want him cursing us and cursing our God. But you know the story. David wanted to go to war against him, and so Saul said, all right, if you're going to go to war against him, put on my armor. Well, it swallowed David up. David said, this is not going to get it. I'm going to do this the way God wants me to. What a beautiful story. So here comes little David, and you can imagine Goliath. Can you imagine what he said that day? Is this the best you people can do? Little old runt. I can hear him laughing and jeering now. And the whole time he's standing there jeering, of course he's in full armor, and there's only one place on his armor where he is vulnerable. And that was right here. I mean, if he hit him here, or even on the head, or he wouldn't face him. One spot right here. And so old Goliath comes out with his javelin in his hand, and little David's walking toward him. And as he's walking, he reaches into his pack and he pulls out a stone. And now all of that training in the Judean desert, as he was throwing rocks at, well, there weren't any telephone poles in those days, were there? Or whatever he was throwing rocks at. I can see him though now, and he's twirling faster and faster. And Goliath is walking toward him, and he's spewing all kinds of vile words. And about that time, David lets the rock go. And the only place that it would have hurt him, he hit him right there. Wow. All of that practice for that one moment. And Goliath fell. And when Goliath fell, all the Philistines turned and they ran. Well, people began to say things. They began to say things like, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. So King Saul would go walking down the street. He would hear people whispering. There goes Saul. But David has killed many more than him. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000. And you don't get wrapped up in the numbers or you don't take it literally, but that's a way of saying Saul's good, but David's great. Now, let's come back to the psychological profile of Saul. Here's a man who's arrogant, impulsive, unfaithful, prideful, and emotionally unstable. What is he going to think when people begin to say behind his back, we'd rather have David than Saul? Paranoid, jealous, hate. Well, do what? To say the least. Saul tried to kill David on several occasions. tried to kill his own son. Do you remember that? With a javelin. Because Jonathan had befriended David. Oh my goodness. Well, we could go on and on, but suffice it to say, Saul really went off his rocker. David had several opportunities to take his life. Did you read that? But David would not touch God's anointed. Didn't that say something about his heart? It says something about David's heart. Well, in the end, the Israelites were fighting the Philistines. And on Mount Carmel, in this area, Mount Carmel, Saul was injured in battle. And, well, let me back up. I missed one thing. Before he was injured, he went to a lady for some advice. Who was that? Remember? The witch of Endor. Remember when he went to a witch? And he was so distraught. He was so upset and so distraught that in the end, when he needed to know some truth, he went to a witch. I want you to conjure up Samuel. Samuel will tell me what's going to happen to me. What's my fate going to be? Well, he was told that his fate would be very grim. And so on Mount Carmel, when he went to battle with the Philistines, Saul was wounded. He begged his armor bearer to kill him. When he wouldn't do it, what did Saul do? He took his own life. So that's why I say King Saul, who had a great start, but obviously, even though he looked like he had a great start, something was wrong in here, wasn't it? His heart never was in the right place. David, though he didn't look all that great, from the very moments when he was a young boy keeping sheep out in the desert, he had a heart after God. What does the Bible say? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. God looks at the heart. He doesn't look at our failures, our successes. He doesn't look at how beautiful we are or how many talents we have. God doesn't usually use superstars. Well, he never uses superstars. Look at the Bible. He uses people who have talents and gifts, but people who will give their hearts to him. And by the way, that gives me hope. And I think it probably does you too. Well, we've got to move on, obviously. The second, we've already been talking about him, the second king in the United Monarchy after Saul had died was David, who reigned from 1010 to 970 BC. 1010 to 970 BC. Now let me say a few things about David, then we're going to take a break. When David became king, first things he did tells us something about David. Well, the first thing he did was he defeated the Philistines once and for all. Thank the Lord. The second thing he did, now get this, listen carefully. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, notice what he did. One of the first things he wanted to do in chapter 6 of 2 Samuel, we won't read it, but it tells us the account of David bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Now, all during the reign of Saul, where was the Ark of the Covenant? It was still sitting in that place, Kiriath Yearim, in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 2. Now listen, Saul never made an attempt, not one attempt, to go get the Ark of the Covenant. Does that not tell us something else about Saul? The first thing David wanted to do was, let's go get the Ark of the Covenant, and let's bring it to Jerusalem. You feel the difference between Saul and David? So, David gets the Ark, and he brings it to Jerusalem. Now, at this time, Jerusalem, which is right here, 2,455 feet above sea level, it's in the mountains. If you would go to Jerusalem today, you look like you're in the mountains, Blue Ridge Mountains, except they don't look blue. And Jerusalem, or Jebus as it was called at that time, was inhabited by a group of people called the Jebusites. that Joshua did not wipe out. So one of the first things David did was he took his men into Jerusalem. They went up the water shaft, surprise, surprise, into Jerusalem, defeated the Jebusites, and made Jerusalem the capital of Israel. He brought the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath Yearim down to Jerusalem. David defeated the Moabites and the Ammonites. Now, who was Moab and Ammon?
2 of the 12.
Remember Lot? A horrible story, horrible story. Lot and his 2 daughters, they got him drunk. They both lay with him to have... Okay, no, horrible. I mean, it makes the Young and the Restless look like Walt Disney. So anyway, he defeated the Moabites. He defeated the Ammonites. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. He defeated the Philistines. Here's what was happening. He's the first person to completely settle the nation, unify the nation, and bring peace to the nation. Completely. And make God the ruler of the people by bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem.
Is that the last time there was peace in Israel?
No, but it's the first. It's the first time.
Yeah.
David's the one who really unified the people. He brought peace. He brought unity. He defeated the enemies. I mean, he brought them together. And the people never forgot that. What is the flag today of Israel? What is it called? The Magen David. The shield of David. Magen David. And it's interesting. Let me show you a little something. This is kind of just an interesting side note. But the symbol of Israel, of course, that's the Star of David, which is a 6-pointed star. When we think of a star, it's 5, but this is 6. But this symbol is made up of 2 triangles, upside down. In the Greek language, this is what letter? Delta. D. David. David. So, David became, I'm going to say this, we're going to take a break. David became the first picture, the first hint, the first hope of the people for a Messiah. This is our Messiah. He's brought us together. He's given us peace. He's unified our nation. He's defeated our enemies. This is him. And everybody lived happily ever after, and David was perfect from then on out. One of the awfulest stories is yet to be shared. It's terrible. It's horrible. And after break, I'm going to share it with you. Any questions before we break? All right, let's take a break.
This is the end of the first half of the lesson. The remainder can be found on CD 2 of this set. This is CD 2 and contains the remainder of Disciple 1, Lesson 9.
Okay. Now, what you probably noticed, or you haven't, but you will, is we had been tracing the Messianic line, Genesis 3:15, Genesis 49:10, and verses like that to talk about He's coming, He's coming. We haven't heard any of that lately, have we? So it's like the Messianic line sort of submarines. Well, tonight with David, it comes back to the top in clear view. I want to show you something. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 7. And again, this tells us something about David. Can you get a real clear understanding and feeling of the difference between Saul and David? I mean, as you look at this, it really becomes apparent the differences in the two and how God looks at our heart rather than our abilities and all of that. But look at something else about David. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Get your highlighters ready. You'll want to highlight this. Before we read that in chapter 7, beginning with verse 11, one of the first things David wanted to do was he wanted to build God a house. Now let me clarify what I mean by that, or what he meant by that. At this point, the Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem in a tent. And David said, Lord, I want to build I want to build a palace. I want to build a temple. I want to build something that will permanently house this rather than a tent. Lord, you're deserving more than that. Let's build something that will bring glory and honor and praise to you. I want to build you a house, God. Notice what the Lord said to David through the prophet Nathan. Chapter 7, verse 11, the last part of that verse. Nathan says to David, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son, and when he does wrong, I will punish him, and the rod of men with floggings inflicted by men, but my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Now look at verse 16. Your house, talking about David, your house and your kingdom will endure forever. Before me, your throne will be established forever. Now notice, David says, God, I want to build you a house. I love you that much. And God says, David, I thank you for loving me. I love you too. But let me tell you, instead of you building me a house, I'm going to build you a house. Now, David, as far as building me a house, that's not your responsibility. That'll be your son's responsibility. Of course, we'll see in a few moments, that's one of the things that Solomon, David's son, did. But the main thing God said to David was, David, because you love me and you're a man after my own heart, I'm going to build a house for you. I'm going to establish through you a kingdom that will never end. Did you notice that? Look at verse 16. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever. Before me, your throne will be established forever. Now, obviously, something's going on here because nobody's going to live forever. So here he's going to establish a kingdom through David that will be forever. Now, put your finger here and turn with me, please, to the book of Luke. These become the words which give us the reason why these words in Luke were spoken. And I think now they'll have more meaning for you. We are just about to enter the season coming up. By the way, the last Sunday this month, the 28th of November, we begin the Christian season called Advent. Now, do you know what Advent means, the word Advent? The word Advent means coming or arrival. Advent is, you take Christmas Day back up 4 Sundays, and then that's where you begin Advent. That's the 4 Sundays before Christmas is where we begin to anticipate what the birth and the coming and the arrival of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, meant to us and to the world. Look at Luke chapter 1, verse 30. The angel said to Mary, do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. Now look at verse 32. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end. Those words spoken are in direct correlation with these words. Turn back now to 2 Samuel 7, where God said to David through Nathan the prophet, your house and your kingdom will endure forever. Before me, your throne will be established forever. And so it was through the line of David that the Messiah would come. So the people now began to see David as the prototype, the promise, the hope of what Messiah would be. They even, in succeeding generations, the coming Messiah was referred to as the B'nai David, the son of David. Not direct son, but descendant of David. So David became the standard. What is the Messiah going to be like? It's going to be like David. He's going to bring peace. He's going to unify us. He's going to make us strong. He's going to defeat our enemies. He's going to establish us. We're going to be strong. We're going to be safe. We're going to be happy. David, David, David. He's going to be like David. He's going to be another David. He's going to be a descendant of David. He's going to be the son of David. So here, the promise is, David, from you will come a kingdom that will never end. And then when the angel announces to Mary, you're going to have a son, and he will sit on the throne of his father David. He's going to be a descendant of David. And his kingdom shall never end. Obviously, here in 2 Samuel 7, this is a messianic promise that from the line of David is going to come the Messiah whose kingdom will never end. Now, wish we could stop right here. It's about 8:27 and go home, but we can't do it. And this is another thing I love about this book. It doesn't just report the good things and hide the bad things. That would tell me this book's not really inspired. That's just man's concoction of a book to try to coerce us to believe something. But this book is so dogged honest. It reports the good, the bad, and the ugly. And now, we are getting ready to talk about the ugly. So buckle your seatbelts, please. David, a man after God's own heart, who loved the Lord so much, he wanted to bring the Ark of the Covenant. He wanted to build God a house. Oh, he loved him so much. Oh, my. When we get to 2 Samuel chapter 11, wish we could rip these chapters out of the Bible. One day, David sent his men off to war, and David is lounging back in the palace of ease and luxury. And he happens to look out of his window, and he sees this bathing beauty. Quite a babe. And David said, come here. Who is that chick down there? That's Bathsheba. Who is she? She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Where's Uriah? He's off to war. Oh. Bring her here. Now buckle your seatbelts, please. And you already know where I'm going. David allowed his lust to get the best of him, and he enticed her, and he lured her, and he seduced her, and, well, you know what happened. David thought that everything was cool, but then in a few weeks, he got the report from Bathsheba that she was pregnant. Can you imagine David's palms getting sweaty, thinking, oh, dear God, what can I do now? I've got to do something. I've got to cover my tracks. I've got to cover my tracks. So he came up with a plan. He said, Joab was his armor bearer. Joab, come here. Now just listen to all this concoct. First of all, David is an adulterer. He says, Joab, where is her husband? He's Uriah. He's out in the military. Bring him in. Give him a furlough. Give him 2 weeks. Bring him in so he can spend some time with his wife and his family. And then my tracks will be covered. Well, David didn't anticipate what would happen. Uriah was so devoted to his colleagues and his comrades. He said, why should I come in and have a furlough and live in ease and luxury for a weekend when my fellow comrades are right here on the battleground? I won't do it. They brought him in, and he wouldn't even stay with his own wife. He said, I'm not going to do it. My comrades are out there, and I shouldn't be doing this. Well, he wouldn't do it. Joab reports, David, we've got problems. He will not stay. He won't sleep with his wife. What else can we do, Joab? Is there something we can do? Joab, I know what we can do. When's the next battle? Well, it's tomorrow, as a matter of fact. Put Uriah on the front lines tomorrow. When you go into battle, I want you to storm in, but then at the heat of the battle, I want everybody to pull back and leave Uriah out there by himself. Yes, sir. So, I can see David pacing, thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Well, in a few days, they're having some kind of a cocktail gathering there in the I'm making all this up now, okay? I'm just trying to contemporize it. They're standing there, you know, in the palace, and David sees Joab, his armor bearer, slip in, and he gets David's attention, and he goes, David, it's done. And I can see a smile come over David's face, and he wipes his brow, and he says, thank God. Uriah is dead. So David can now take Bathsheba as his wife, and his tracks are covered. He's escaped, hasn't he? Not at all. Look at chapter 11, verse 27. David forgot one thing. Look at the very last sentence in that chapter. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. I don't know how long it was, maybe 6, 8, 10, maybe as much as a year from the time David committed this adultery, lies, deceit, and murder. Did you hear me? Here's sweet David, a man after God's own heart. Adultery, lies, and murder. He thinks his tracks are covered, probably. And so, a few months later, one day, as David's trying to hide this thing and push it back in his life and hope that no one, including God, will see what's happened, he thinks he's covered his tracks. One day, Nathan the prophet, chapter 12, 2 Samuel, Nathan bebops into his office and says, David. Yes, Nathan, come on in. I want to ask you a question. Sure, go ahead. I want your advice, okay? And Nathan says, David, I know a man. He's got one little ewe lamb. Oh, he loves that lamb. That lamb is like his family. He loves that. That's the only thing he possesses. He loves that lamb so much. And then David, there's this other man who's rich. He's got so many lambs he can't count them. And this rich man had a friend that was coming to town, and he wanted to kill a lamb to provide a meal. But David, he wouldn't kill one of his own lambs. Do you know what he did? What did he do? He went and took this one little ewe lamb away from this poor man and slaughtered that lamb. And I can see David now, fire's getting in his eyes. And Nathan says, David, what should we do? And David jumps up from his desk and says, that man ought to die. And Nathan the prophet stood up and put his bony finger right in David's face and said, you're the man. You're the man. Look at it, 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7. You are the man. And David's world came crashing in. All of a sudden, however many months he'd been running from the Lord, it all came crashing in. Oh God, what have I done? What have I done? Will you please turn with me to Psalm 51? I want to show you something. We have a whole lesson on the Psalms, but I want to show you Psalm 51. This is one of my favorite Psalms. Look at the preface, that little subscript there before Psalm 51. What does yours say? Does it say, for the director of music, a psalm of David, when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba? This is David's prayer after Nathan said, you're the man. The blood's on your hands. You're guilty. You haven't covered your tracks. God has seen everything you have done. And his world came crashing in. And listen to what David cried out. Look at this psalm. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. In other words, I couldn't get away from it. I tried to run. I tried to hide. I tried to cover my tracks. But when I went to bed, it was there. When I got up in the morning, it was there. I couldn't get away. Against you and you only I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. Now look at verse 10. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Who do you think he had in mind when he prayed those words? Saul. Oh God, don't let happen to me what happened to Saul. Don't remove your spirit from me. Please God, don't. Look at verse 12. Restore me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. Then I will again teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will turn back to you. Beautiful psalm. The occasion of the psalm was David's cry to God when Nathan showed him what he had done and said, David, stop running. Stop running. You've messed up. And David cried out to God. Now, turn back to 2 Samuel chapter 12 with me a moment. Notice what else Nathan the prophet said to David in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Now, here's what that means. When David cried out to God for forgiveness, God forgave him. But God didn't take away the consequences of his actions, did he? For the rest of David's life, he paid and paid dearly for what he had done. Now, God forgave him. God forgave the guilt. And when we ask forgiveness for anything, God will forgive. But if we've got ourselves into some kind of a mess, God may not just deliver us from our mess. He may forgive us, but He'll help us, but we may have to get out of our mess. God doesn't just take away the consequences of our actions. You see the difference there? You say, well, what consequences? Well, let me rattle some off to you in rapid-fire succession. For instance, the child that was conceived by that adulterous relationship, what happened to the child? The child died. Now, David did have other sons and daughters, but listen to what happened to some of them. David's son, Amnon, raped David's daughter, Tamar. Here's a brother committing an incestuous crime against his sister, David's son and David's daughter. Oh, we could go off into different directions with this one, but, I mean, what could David say? I mean, did his children... did they know this story about what he had done? How he had been unfaithful to his wife? How he had created murder and deceit? David was suffering the consequences of his own actions. Look what else happened. Later on, Amnon, David's son, was killed by his brother Absalom. So now David's one son kills his brother. Okay, a little bit later on, David's son Absalom tries to steal the throne away from David. Well, David has two choices. He can kill his own son, or he can flee to save his son. Well, David had to flee. His own son tried to usurp his father and take his throne away from him. A little bit later, Absalom, David's son, was killed. A little bit later, a man by the name of Sheba, who is akin to King Saul, he revolts and tries to take the throne. A little bit later, Adonijah, David's son, tries to take the throne away from his father David. Later, Adonijah, David's son, is killed by Solomon, David's son. On and on and on. Family tragedy, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. Nathan said, David, God forgives you, but because of what you've done, there is a cause and effect law in life, and the sword will cut you for the rest of your life. It'll never depart from your house. Now, here's what I want you to see more than anything. If you look at Saul and you look at David, what's the difference? Saul went off his rocker, but look what David did. Adultery, murder, deceit, lies. What's worse? What's the difference between Saul and David? Let me tell you what I think the difference is. When the chips were down and they were both on rock bottom, where did Saul turn to? The witch. He went to a witch to try to find out the truth. When the chips were down for David and Nathan said, thou art the man, where did David turn? Psalm 51. Where do you turn when the chips are down? Bad boys, what are you going to do? What are you going to do when they come for you? What are you going to do? Where are you going to turn? Are you going to turn to a witch? Which we can say synonymously, he turned to the devil. David turned back to the Lord. That's the difference. We're sinners, aren't we? Hopefully not to the magnitude of some of these things. But when we're down, where do we turn? That's the difference. That's the difference. Okay. David lived out the rest of his life, and he died an old man. And then, when he died, his son Solomon took over as king. Solomon reigned from 970 BC to 930 BC. Now, understand the differences between David and Solomon. When David came to the throne, he had to work hard to unify the land, defeat the enemies, bring peace and security, trust with the people. Oh, the people trusted him. They loved him. They would have died for him. So when under David's administration, David united the land. When Solomon was born and became king, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He didn't have to work. Work? What's work? By the way, I'm showing my age now. Who was it that would say, work? Maynard G. Krebs. How many of you remember that? Dobie Gillis. Well, that's what Solomon would have said. Work? No, I'm not going to work. My old man's done all the work. But look at here, man, all these palaces, and all I have to do is lie down and the women feed me grapes and fan me. I'm not going to do that. So Solomon was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and so what he did was he inherited the unity, he inherited the peace, he inherited the money, but he wanted more. So what did Solomon do? Well, Solomon was the one who built this lavish temple, palatial temple on Mount Moriah, which is right in Jerusalem, the place where Abraham was going to offer Isaac his son. Keith, did you go into the Dome of the Rock when you went to Israel? Did you go into the Dome of the Rock? Yeah, big rock in there. Did you go in there, Mark? In Jerusalem today, the golden domed Dome of the Rock, which is the third most holy site to the Muslims, that is the original site where Solomon's temple was. That's where Solomon's temple was built.
The temple.
Solomon's temple?
Yeah.
The Babylonians in 586 BC. And we'll talk all about that. We'll talk all about that. Believe me, will be a lot of dates and a lot of history, but in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came in and razed it to the ground. Okay, so Solomon built this lavish, I mean marble and mahogany and gold and silver, and what Jim Baker built was nothing compared to what Solomon did. I mean, it was something. But now get this. This tells us something about Solomon. How long did it take him to build the palace? I mean, the temple. 7 years. How long did it take him to build his own house, his palace?
13 years.
Bingo. Good. 13 years. Now something's wrong there. That tells us if it took him twice as long to build his own palace, that doesn't give me such a good feeling about Solomon. Now, here's another thing. How are we going to pay for this lavish palace and this lavish temple? How are we going to pay for this? We'll raise property taxes. So a new assessment of property goes out in Jerusalem. And the taxes go up, 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 up. And there was such a thing called conscripted labor in that day, which means you could be walking down the streets of Jerusalem and an official comes up to you and says, you, come on. For the next 6 months, you're to work on this corner of the temple right here. Whatever you're doing, quit it. Right here. I mean, man, you could be drafted into service at any moment for any length of time. Conscripted labor. People didn't like that. People didn't like paying high taxes. Well, Solomon was making a lot of enemies. Boy, was he making a lot of enemies. Okay, how can he ensure the peace of the nation that my father had worked so hard for? I mean, things are starting to kind of unravel. How can I ensure that someone won't attack me from the north or from the south and the east? What can I do? I know what I'll do. I'll marry the king of Tyre's daughter. He won't attack me then. He won't attack his own daughter. So all of these 700 wives, did you read about that, by the way? That wasn't because Solomon was a real man. What that's about was political and economic alliances. That's all it was. He married these women from other nations to ensure that he would not be attacked by these other nations.
These women were more like hostages.
Basically. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what that was all about.
That was common in Europe.
Oh, sure.
I mean,
Sure. It was a cultural... Oh, yeah, wasn't right, wasn't good, but it happened. It happened. Now, look with me at 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11. The first few chapters of 1 Kings, of course, are about Solomon and his dedication of the temple. But then when you get to chapter 11, we read about all of these wives that he took. Look at 1 Kings chapter 11, verse number 4. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtaroth and the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Look at verse 11. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of who? Your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant. So, it was not men, I got to tell you this, it was not his wives that turned him away from the Lord. It was the fact that whenever they would come in from these foreign nations, as he would make these economic and military alliances with these other nations, when he would let these women come into his harem, then they would bring their gods with them. And Solomon was basically saying, sure, there's always room for one more. Bring your God and come on. And what eventually happened was Solomon's faith then was turned away from the Lord, and he began to accept the worship and the adoration of these other gods. And it was these other gods that turned Solomon away. And so God said to Solomon, because of what you've done, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you, but because of David, I'm going to let them keep one tribe. One tribe. Keep that in mind. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Well, things got worse and worse and worse. Higher taxes, higher taxes, higher taxes. And I mean it was like a seething kettle. I mean, people were angry. And so finally, when Solomon died, then Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was supposed to take over. So in 930 BC, after Solomon died and Rehoboam came to the throne, he got some bad counsel. Some people said, now, Rehoboam, here's what you need to do. Your father made it hard on the people. You better lax up. You better lax up on the taxes. You better make it easier on the people. If you don't, bad things will happen. Well, Rehoboam got some bad counsel from some other people who said these words. If you want to continue to live the lifestyle you're living, you better not lax up. You better raise taxes, and you better put your thumb even harder on the people. So Rehoboam came out one day and he announced to the nation, he said, I've made my decision what I'm going to do and how I'm going to rule. And this is in essence what he said. You think my father made it hard on you? You haven't seen anything yet. And on that day, in 930 BC, when he announced that he was going to continue the policies of his father with high and heavy taxation, and 10 of the tribes, 10 of them, broke away and said, then we want nothing else to do with you. We want nothing else to do with David. We want nothing else to do with your line whatsoever. We're going to draw a line in the sand right here, and don't you cross it, and we won't cross it. So in 930 BC, the united monarchy became the divided monarchy. And if you'll look on page 70 in your manual, you will see the division. In this, and you see this, the red line there. Below the red line were two tribes. What tribes were they? Judah and Benjamin. Above the red line were the other 10 tribes. Now here's what happened, folks. Listen, the date is 930 BC. You need to etch that in on the potsherd of your mind. 930 BC is when Israel was divided. And so what the 10 tribes did was they went down to Egypt, and they got a man by the name of Jeroboam, who had been one of Solomon's military officials. And they said, Jeroboam, we've broken away. We have seceded from the union. Will you come and be our king? And Jeroboam said, well, I'd love to. I'd love to. And so the northern 10 tribes, with their capital being Shechem, later called Samaria, basically, that was the 10 tribes. And listen, one of the first things that Jeroboam did was, look up there, you see Dan up at the top? That's the northern extremity of Israel. And you see Bethel at the south. At those two locations, Jeroboam built altars. Now get this. Altars to golden calf worship. Talking about getting off to a good start. And his thought was, we don't want anybody crossing that red line. From now on, we don't know them, and they don't know us, and we don't go there, and they don't come here. And so we don't want any of our people having to go down into Jerusalem to worship. If you want to worship, right here's an altar in Bethel. You can worship golden calves right here. Solomon's son Rehoboam became king of the southern part. Now understand this. From this point on, it's known as Israel, the 10 tribes, and Judah. Benjamin sort of assimilated into Judah. So from now on, it's Israel, the north, and Judah, the south. And Rehoboam, Solomon's son, became the king of Judah, with his capital being Jerusalem.
Is there any significance to the fact they all ruled for 40 years?
Well, that's a good question. And there's different schools of thought. Some see it as being literally, that's how many years they ruled. Others see the number 40 as being sort of a significant number. And it is, you think, 40 days and 40 nights for the ark, and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So some say, well, it might not be exactly 40 years, but they sort of round it off to that number since that's sort of a meaningful, easy to remember number. I don't know. I sort of take the simplest route by saying I believe it was probably around 40 years. That's a good question. There's a lot of numerology in the Bible. When we get to the book of Revelation in May, and by the way, you don't want to miss that one, numbers mean something all the way through the. There's a message in each number, and it's like you got to understand what the number means to decode the message of the book of Revelation. So we'll get into that when we get into the book of Revelation. So in the words of Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it is. 930 BC. Israel and Judah. A divided land. A divided people. Two kings. One getting started with idolatry. One getting started with Yahweh. That's the way it is. So the three kings of the united monarchy, Saul, David, and Solomon. Now, in closing, let me say this. and I'm not being judgmental here, but let's do some conjecture just a moment. David, I expect to see David in heaven. I do. I want to sit down with him and talk with him one day. Saul, I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I would want to be Saul. He went out kind of a bad way. What about Solomon? What about Solomon?
Maybe.
Well, I think he's more than a maybe. I think we'll see Solomon. I'll tell you why. Because Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes in his lifetime. Have you ever read the book of Ecclesiastes? It's the story of a man, and it identifies him. It doesn't say he was Solomon, but it says he was the king in Jerusalem, the son of David. Well, that pretty much narrows down who it was. But here's a man who almost writes an autobiography of himself. And that whole book is about him trying everything under the sun. Wine, women, and song. I tried it all. And I said, yes, this is going to be the ultimate meaning and purpose in life. And then a few verses later, he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It left me empty. But then I'm going to try this. Yes, sir, this is it. When I do this, I'm going to find the meaning in life. And then a few verses later, no, that left me empty too. I mean, he tries everything under the sun. Finally, the last chapter, chapter 12, he comes full circle, and he says, all right, this is my conclusion of the matter. Fear God. Love him, for in this is the meaning of life. Now, if Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, which I believe he did, then Ecclesiastes basically tells his story. And it tells me that in the end, like his father, he came back. He came back. So, it's not so much where you go and what you've done. It's kind of where you end up, isn't it? And when the chips are down, where do you turn? And the good news is, guess what? The arms of grace are always open. It's never too late. It's never too late. It's never too late. Saul thought it was, and so he turned to the witch. David was running, thought he had covered his tracks, but he was found out. And when he was found out, he said, oh God, have mercy on me. So it comes right back down to where's your heart, doesn't it? Not what you've done, but where's your heart? Not how many failures you've had, but where's your heart? If your heart's desire is to seek first the kingdom and to love him with all your heart, then you're like David. You're a man after God's own heart. And that's it. I love this lesson. I just really, really like it. Any questions or comments? Jeroboam
was the king of
Israel.
northern
Israel, right.
Who was the king of southern Israel?
Rehoboam, David's son. Solomon's son. Rehoboam. Some strange names there, but
Did Israel go bankrupt without the 10 tribes? I mean, did all the buildings stop and all the decadence?
it pretty much leveled off there. It pretty much leveled off. It didn't grow anymore. In Jerusalem you're talking about. Yeah. And it stayed intact until 586 BC.
Yeah. Nebuchadnezzar came out of where?
Babylon. We'll talk all about that. Now listen, folks. Next week is going to be a lesson like you've never had before in your life. It's going to be different. We're going to veer away from go ahead and do your reading this week. But we're going to veer away because I've got to take you into a different world next week. As we read through the Old Testament, we read about this. Now, we often pronounce it Baal. In Hebrew, it's Baal. And we read about Asherah. Who is Baal and who is Asherah? And what was their mindset and their thinking? Next week, I'm going to take you into the mysterious world of Baal, probably deeper than you want to go. And it gets R-rated at times, let me warn you. It gets R-rated. But you're adults, you can handle it. But we need to understand who these people were, and not people, but what these things were, and how the people thought. And what you're going to find out is Baal is still alive today. Because the way they thought, a lot of people in our society still think today. They don't worship a grotesque image, but they follow the teachings of Baal.
Well, let's get started right now. I can't wait till for the cliffhanger. I feel like I'm watching television.
Just don't shoot me, okay? Let's pray together. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you so much for your word. It's really exciting, Lord, to read about these characters, and we're so thankful that your word is so honest and down to earth. Because, Lord, we're not perfect either, and you know that. But we're also thankful for your amazing grace that we see touching David and Solomon and so many people, Lord, who seem to have gone too far, but I guess we can never go too far. We can never stray away from your grace. And so tonight, Lord, thank you for your grace and your love, and we accept it, and we ask you to wrap yourself around us, that as we leave this place tonight, we know that you are with us. The Lord is our shepherd. And because you are our shepherd, goodness and mercy shall follow us all the days of our life. And then one day we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Lord, it is in that hope and that truth and with your grace we go forth in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.